Every year, the Union Budget stands as one of the most significant economic events in India. It is the moment when citizens learn how the government plans to collect and allocate the nation's financial resources. This year's budget arrived during an exceptionally challenging global climate. International trade dynamics are shifting rapidly, supply chains face unprecedented disruption, and emerging technologies like artificial intelligence are transforming traditional commerce and governance systems worldwide. Against this backdrop, the finance minister delivered an extensive speech filled with ambitious announcements, painting an optimistic picture of India's economic future. The budget presentation included several headline-grabbing initiatives. Among them were Semiconductor Mission 2.0, the proposed development of 7 high-speed rail corridors connecting major cities, content creator labs planned across thousands of schools and colleges, 5 university townships near industrial corridors, artificial intelligence tools for governance, medical tourism hubs, and sprawling mega-textile parks. The sheer volume of announcements was impressive, creating a sense that monumental transformation was imminent. However, budgets are fundamentally about numbers. When one carefully examines the actual financial allocations behind these grand pronouncements, a revealing pattern begins to emerge, one that deserves serious public attention and informed discussion. The middle-class taxpayer enters every budget season hoping for meaningful relief. This year, domestic consumption has been declining, household savings have been shrinking, and economists widely agree that putting more disposable income into the hands of ordinary consumers could stimulate economic growth. Despite these expectations, the budget brought no changes to the core income tax slabs and no reduction in fundamental tax rates. Some minor procedural adjustments were introduced, such as extending the deadline for filing revised tax returns from December to March and decriminalizing certain minor technical offenses to reduce judicial burden. The new Income Tax Act 2025 was announced to take effect in April 2026, though its practical benefits remain uncertain. Meanwhile, investors faced an active increase in their tax burden. The securities transaction tax on futures trading was raised from 0.02% to 0.05%, while the tax on options trading increased from 0.1% to 0.15%. This steep hike directly affects millions of retail investors participating in futures and options markets. The stock market responded immediately and negatively. By the time the budget speech concluded, the Sensex had dropped by approximately 2,800 points, and the Nifty recorded heavy losses, erasing significant investor wealth within hours. The total projected budget size for fiscal year 2026 to 27 stands at approximately 53.47 trillion rupees, representing a 5.57% increase over the previous year's estimate of 50.65 trillion rupees. Understanding where this money originates is essential for evaluating the budget's priorities. The single largest source of government funding is borrowing, constituting 24% of total revenue, meaning a full quarter of government spending relies on debt. Individual income tax accounts for 21%, corporate tax contributes 18%, and GST, along with other indirect taxes, makes up 15%. When individual income tax and GST are combined, ordinary citizens contribute approximately 36% of total revenue, double the 18% contributed by corporate entities. Historical data shows that corporate tax contributions were once proportionally much higher relative to individual contributions. Over recent years, corporations have received increased financial relief and incentives, while the relative burden on individual taxpayers has grown. This shift deserves careful examination in any honest policy discussion. On the expenditure side, the largest single outflow goes toward distributing mandatory constitutional shares of collected taxes to state governments, which is entirely normal within India's federal structure. The second largest expense, however, is striking. Interest payments on accumulated national debt consume approximately 20% of the entire budget. 1/5 of all government revenue goes solely towards servicing interest on old loans, without even reducing the principal amount. After accounting for these two massive obligations, the remaining funds must cover education, health, infrastructure, defense, agriculture, and employment generation. The budget's education announcements sounded transformative. 5 university townships near industrial corridors, dedicated girls' hostels in every district for women in STEM, upgrades to 4 national telescope facilities, a new National Institute of Design in eastern India, and content creator labs in 15,000 schools and 500 colleges were all prominently featured. However, the total education allocation stands at 1.39 trillion rupees, only 8.3% higher than the previous year's 1.29 trillion rupees. When evaluated as a percentage of GDP, education spending remains below 3%. The Kothari Commission recommended 6% of GDP for education back in 1964, and the new education policy of 2020 reiterated this same target. After 6 decades, the country remains dramatically short of this benchmark. This chronic underfunding has tangible consequences. Over the last decade, approximately 90,000 government schools have been closed across the country. Severe teacher shortages persist, physical infrastructure deteriorates, and the quality of instruction in underfunded government schools remains inadequate. The budget makes no transformative announcements regarding foundational school-level education reform, comprehensive teacher training, or curriculum modernization. The brutal competitiveness of Indian entrance examinations is not merely a population problem. Countries with higher population density than India, such as the Netherlands, do not face similar crises because their governments have invested proportionally in building sufficient educational institutions. Healthcare announcements included upgrading institutions for allied health professionals, training 150,000 new caregivers for the aging population, addressing mental health concerns, granting customs duty exemptions on 17 cancer treatment drugs, and establishing 5 regional medical hubs for medical tourism. The total health allocation is 1.05 trillion rupees, a 6.4% increase from the previous year's 983 billion rupees. The World Health Organization recommends that developing nations spend at least 5% of GDP on public health. India's health spending remains stubbornly near 2%. The fundamental need for affordable, accessible, quality primary health care for ordinary citizens receives insufficient attention amid announcements about specialized hubs and niche programs. Capital expenditure for creating long-term physical assets like roads, railways, ports, and bridges was projected at 12.22 trillion rupees, up from 11.21 trillion rupees. The budget also mentioned developing city economic regions and 7 high-speed rail corridors connecting major urban centers. Yet the specific allocation for urban development actually decreased. This year's allocation stands at 855.22 billion rupees, down from 967.77 billion rupees the previous year, representing an 11.6% decline. This is the funding that local municipalities depend on for clean drinking water, sewage systems, waste management, and public transport. While high-speed rail corridors make impressive headlines, crumbling intra-city infrastructure, chronic urban flooding, and deteriorating local roads receive no comprehensive renewal program. The allocation for combating urban air pollution is equally concerning. Only 10.91 billion rupees were earmarked, lower than the previous revised estimate of 13 billion rupees. More alarmingly, budget documents reveal that in fiscal year 2024-25, out of 8.58 billion rupees allocated for pollution control, only 160 million rupees were actually spent on the ground, representing less than 2% utilization. Even when funds exist in the treasury, they remain unused, suggesting a fundamental gap between stated intentions and actual implementation. Youth unemployment is among India's most pressing socio-economic challenges. Millions enter the job market annually, and many find no employment at all. The budget addresses this through indirect measures across 7 strategic manufacturing sectors, including biopharma, semiconductors, electronics, rare earths, chemicals, capital goods, and textiles. Programs include mega textile parks, digital skilling initiatives, revival of 200 legacy industrial clusters, a 100 billion rupee SME growth fund, and an education to employment standing committee. While these initiatives have merit, they set no firm numerical targets for job creation, no defined quality standards for employment, and no binding timelines. India requires sustainable employment solutions at a massive scale, with 10 to 12 million young people entering the workforce annually. Long-term industrial development programs, however valuable, cannot address the immediate crisis. The newly formed committee is a bureaucratic mechanism whose recommendations and implementation could take years to materialize. The defense budget increased significantly to 5.95 trillion rupees from 4.92 trillion rupees, constituting approximately 11% of total expenditure. However, no specific policy announcements accompanied this increase, disappointing domestic defense manufacturers who expected major procurement contracts. Defense stocks declined sharply despite the financial increase. Agriculture, upon which more than half of India's population depends, received approximately 1.63 trillion rupees, a marginal increase from 1.59 trillion rupees that becomes negligible when adjusted for inflation. Niche schemes were announced for inland fisheries, animal husbandry credit, coconut promotion, and high-value export crops. However, systemic issues affecting the vast majority of ordinary farmers, including landless agricultural workers, rising fertilizer costs, minimum support price reforms, and rural debt, received virtually no attention. The budget fundamentally fails to address the daily survival needs of India's farming population. The budget explicitly acknowledges a hostile external environment threatening free trade and multilateralism. In response, several strategic steps were outlined. Semiconductor Mission 2.0 was launched, the Electronics Components Manufacturing Scheme received increased funding, and dedicated initiatives were announced for rare earth mineral corridors and chemical processing parks. A 100 billion rupee allocation for domestic shipping container manufacturing aims to reduce dependence on foreign supply chains. Export duty concessions were announced across multiple sectors. However, one controversial provision warrants scrutiny. Foreign technology companies have been offered a complete corporate tax holiday, extending to 2047 for establishing cloud service data centers in India. Large-scale data centers consume enormous quantities of electricity and water for cooling operations. In developed countries, communities near data centers have already reported environmental concerns, including water contamination and resource depletion. For a developing nation already facing severe water stress, topsoil degradation, and energy infrastructure challenges, offering unconditional 20-year tax exemptions to resource-intensive foreign operations raises legitimate environmental and economic questions. Regarding artificial intelligence, the budget mentions AI applications for governance and a multilingual translation tool. However, no dedicated major financial allocations were earmarked for foundational AI research in universities. Global research firms estimate that over 300 million traditional jobs worldwide face disruption from generative AI. The budget presents no clear, funded strategy to proactively address this potential employment catastrophe. Across education, healthcare, urban infrastructure, agriculture, and employment, a consistent pattern emerges. Ambitious announcements generate positive media coverage, but actual financial allocations remain insufficient relative to the scale of challenges. Education needs 6% of GDP, but receives less than 3%. Healthcare needs 5%, but remains at 2%. Urban development funding has actively decreased. Agriculture allocations barely keep pace with inflation. Employment measures remain indirect and lack concrete targets. Previous budgets have followed similar trajectories. Grand promises made years ago, including initiatives like building 100 smart cities, have shown limited results in actual implementation. The gap between political rhetoric and ground-level reality remains the central challenge in Indian budgetary governance. Citizens deserve transparent, data-driven discussions about where their tax money goes and whether stated priorities genuinely translate into proportional financial commitments. Understanding these numbers is not merely an academic exercise, but a civic responsibility that directly affects every household across the nation.